talked about these before. Sherman, of course, is not the first person to use these. This is where you just lay down a bunch of logs and you can march across them. You can get wagons across them. It's not great, but it's a lot better than mud that you get stuck in. And so they just build road after road after road, and they just go right along. Sherman doesn't let the weather be a problem at all. And as I mentioned, the Army is even more destructive in South Carolina than Georgia. And despite the terrible weather, Sherman's army advances 10 to 12 miles per day. Joseph Johnston, who by now is in North Carolina, he hears of Sherman's progress, and he said there had been no such army in existence since the day of Julius Caesar. And that's quite a compliment, isn't it, Scott?
Wow.
There had been a heck of a lot of armies in existence, but not like this.
I would put him in the pantheon of top 3 military strategists who've ever lived. Caesar, not Sherman, but so that's quite a compliment.
It really is. Yeah, he's maybe a little bit exaggerating, but the point is that Sherman is blowing everybody away by his progress and just amazing people. Charleston, South Carolina, where it all began, it surrenders on February 18th. The city of Columbia, which is the capital of South Carolina, was burned to the ground. And to this day, there's controversy about who is responsible. A lot of pro-Southern people said, oh, it's Sherman's fault. The Yankees burned it down. Northern people, apologists, say, no, the South, they actually burned it themselves to deny the goods and the supplies to the Union Army. The truth, from what I've been able to ascertain from most scholars, is somewhere in between. In other words, the Confederates set some of the fires on their way out, but the Union didn't always try real hard to put them out, and they probably burned some of the stuff themselves. So it was really both sides, but Columbia is absolutely devastated. And Sherman's army doesn't stop. They keep going. They march into North Carolina. And there on March 20, now we're into 1865, by the way. On March 19th to 21st, he fights the Battle of Bentonville against a small army, 22,000 or so under Joseph Johnston, and the Federals drive the rebels back. And we will leave Sherman there. I'm going to talk a little about the outcome. We'll briefly see how that comes out, the Sherman versus Johnston. Once again, those two are squaring off, but now they're in North Carolina. But let me say this, that Sherman's capture of Atlanta and his marches destroyed hundreds of millions of dollars of Confederate property and supplies. They greatly demoralized the Southern people. And of course, the marches were an overwhelming success. Sherman marched 650 miles in fewer than 100 marching days. They captured 3 state capitals, and they lost fewer than 600 men from the original army of 60,000, which later grew to 100,000. So one of the most brilliant campaigns and amazingly successful campaigns in military history. And it really, really does a 1, 2, 3 punch to the South and really knocks the wind out of them.
And I'd like to just give some numbers to what you said. You mentioned that there was an estimated $100 million worth of damage with the March to the Sea. So how this breaks down, these are just a few things, but the Union Army wrecks 300 miles of railroad lines, bridges, miles of telegraph lines. Remember, this is the 1860s, so we're getting into the age of instantaneous communications. They seize 5,000 horses, 4,000 mules, 13,000 head of cattle. This is where they're feasting. They confiscate 10 million pounds of corn, 10 million pounds of fodder.
That's amazing.
They destroy. I guess that if you have to feed an army, but they destroy cotton gins, mills, the economic backbone of the South. It'd be like today if you were torching server farms for Google. If I could think of what a cotton gin would be in the 21st century sense. So what he does, Sherman, what he accomplishes is amazing because he's going against conventional wisdom of the day. He goes against military principles by going deep into enemy territory without communication lines, without supply lines. But like you said, James, he destroys the South's potential, the motivation to be able to wage war. And the Confederate war effort is completely knocked to pieces. If you're Jefferson Davis and you're trying to or Robert E. Lee, and you're trying to imagine any sort of strategy, I don't know what you could imagine outside of divine providence, some sort of Old Testament story of an archangel coming up and destroying the enemy army. I don't know what else you could hope for at this point to even imagine some sort of victory.
Yeah, and here's the problem too for Lee and the Confederates is that Grant's coming down. He's constantly punching them from the north, and now here comes Sherman. He's gone through Georgia. He's gone through South Carolina. Now he's coming up into North Carolina. He's going to come up from the south, and he'd been, as we saw, he'd lost very few people. His army is well fed. They're tired, of course, but they're well fed. Their morale is really high. Lee is about to be caught in a pincher. He's got, again, Grant pushing down from the north, and Sherman's about to be pushing up from the south. So major problems.
All right. Well, this is the 9th battle, the Battle of Atlanta and the March of the Sea. So battle number 10, where does that take us in the next episode?
We are going to now go back to the east and focus on what happens after General Grant moves to the east and takes command of the Army of the Potomac. At least for all intents and purposes, he becomes the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And we're going to see how Grant is going to come up with his own personal strategy to pound Lee into submission. He's going to begin a campaign of not just attack, but also quite a bit of maneuvering. He's trying to, number one, defeat Lee's army, and number two, get to Richmond and hopefully capture the Confederate capital. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, and one other thing, too, before we finish up, is there's an episode in this feed where I spent about 40 minutes comparing Grant to Lee, and I recommend checking that out before the next episode. I look at a lot of different characteristics, the command style, how clear their orders are, different factors too, what many think spell Grant's victory and then Lee's defeat. So I recommend checking that out to see how these two generals size up and compare with one another. But anyway, we'll return to the East in the next episode and see how the Civil War begins to wrap up. All right, well, that was the episode for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, and especially our spy masters, Baron Freza, Carl from Norway, Chris from Maine, and Melissa Sarnowski, and I'll explain what that means in a second. If you want to support the show and help me keep producing this content, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, subscribe to the show and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to do that, you can go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com, and there you'll find instructions. 2, join our Facebook group, which you can find if you just search for History Unplugged. And please like and share posts that I put up about new episodes. 3, submit a question to me so that I can answer it on air. You can email me at info@historyonthenet.com or leave a voicemail. And again, go to historyunpluggedpodcast.com and you'll find instructions. Lastly, and I think this one is the best, is to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were an elite reconnaissance and espionage detachment of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the History Unplugged membership program. Learn how to join by going to patreon.com/unplugged. So here's what you get if you become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you join at the level of Scout, you can get early access to new podcast episodes, along with enjoying absolutely every single episode of the History Unplugged podcast ad-free. All 270 and counting episodes. If you join at the level of Intelligence Officer, you can also get access to premium episodes, like a multi-part series on the life of Audie Murphy, the most decorated combat soldier in World War II, or the 10-part series Ottoman Lives, a series that looks at the cast of characters that made up the Ottoman Empire, such as the Sultan, the eunuch, the harem servant girl, and the soldier. And finally, if you join at the level of Spy Master, you get all the same stuff as the scouts and intelligence officers, but you also get a shout out to you and or your business at the end of each episode, a 3-pack of hardcover history books, plus you'll be put at the very front of the line for me to answer your question about history, and I can guarantee I will dedicate an episode that's about an hour long or so to your question. Sign up at patreon.com/unplugged. Again, that's patreon.com/unplugged. Anyway, those are the ways you can help out the show. Thank you so much for your support. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get your daily dose of all things history related, from ancient Greece to the Cold War. We'll see you next time at the History Unplugged podcast.